The fields of Dodge County, Nebraska remember everything. They remember the bones of the men who broke the prairie sod in 1874, who drove iron plows through earth that had never known a blade. They remember the dust storms of 1934 that turned noon into midnight and suffocated cattle in their pens. They remember the long, silent years when the creeks ran dry and the sky turned the color of old brass and a farmer could walk his land for an hour and never hear a single living thing. The land keeps its memory in layers, in the dark organic richness of the topsoil where the earthworms tunnel, in the clay hardpan 2 feet down where the old roots reach, in the fractured limestone shelf 40 feet below where cold water pools and waits, patient as anything, for the season to change. Harold Voss understood this in his bones, the way a man understands things that were never formally taught to him but absorbed through decades of close attention, through the sound of a tractor engine straining against wet soil, through the smell of a field before rain, through the way certain low-lying patches stay green 2 weeks longer than the rest of the county after a dry August. He was 72 years old in the autumn of 2022. He had been farming this land since 1973, when his father Edwin pressed the deed into his hands and said, in the terse, unsentimental manner of the plains, "Don't lose it." Edwin had farmed it before him since 1951. Edwin's father, old August Voss, had broken the original sod on this particular 320 acres in 1921, fresh off the train from Waukesha, Wisconsin, with a wife, 2 mules, and a stubbornness that his descendants had apparently inherited as a genetic trait. 3 generations of Voss men had read this land the way other people read books, slowly, with attention to detail, returning to the same passages year after year and finding new meaning each time. In the autumn of 2022, when the most important wheat harvest in a generation was sitting ripe in the fields of Dodge County and every machine with a computer in it had gone suddenly, catastrophically silent, Harold Voss and his 1976 Gleaner L2 combine were the only ones still moving. This is the story of how that happened. Harold Voss came down from the house to the machine shed at 5:45 in the morning, while the stars were still faintly visible in the western sky and the eastern horizon had just begun to think about turning gray. He carried a thermos of black coffee and a flashlight he didn't need. He had walked this path so many times that his feet knew every rut and root, every place where the gravel had washed out, every place where the ground dipped toward the drainage swale. His body navigated by memory while his mind moved ahead to the work of the day. The machine shed was a long, low steel building his father Edwin had erected in 1966. It housed the Gleaner, a 1981 John Deere 4440 utility tractor with a loader on the front, a grain drill, a chisel plow, and 40 years of small implements that never got thrown away because you never knew when you might need them. Along the south wall ran steel shelving units organized with a precision that would have surprised anyone who knew Harold only from the outside, a weathered, unhurried man who moved at the pace of a person with nowhere urgent to be. But Harold's shelving carried the logic of a man who had once spent 18 hours in a field with a combine that wouldn't run because he couldn't find a $5 seal, and had resolved never to let that happen again. Belts in labeled bins, sorted by length and cross-section. Bearings in cardboard boxes stacked in rows. Sprockets, chain segments, idler pulleys. Gaskets cut from sheet material, sealed in wax paper envelopes with handwritten labels. 3 complete sets of sickle sections for the cutting header, enough to replace every blade twice over. Cans of grease, gallons of oil, a hand pump for the bulk fuel tank. To agricultural extension agents who occasionally offered workshops on precision agriculture and operational efficiency, it was grossly over-inventoried. Money sitting on a shelf, depreciating. Capital that could be deployed elsewhere. Harold had heard this argument before, from the bank, from neighbors, and from his own son David, who had moved to Omaha at 22 and built a career in software engineering. David called every few weeks, and Harold valued those calls more than he let on. But David had taken an agricultural economics course at the University of Nebraska and still occasionally returned to the subject of the parts shelf with the gentle persistence of someone who believed efficiency was a virtue close to morality. Harold listened to all such arguments with the patient attention of a man who intends to do exactly what he was planning to do anyway, and continued stocking his shelves. He unlocked the shed and swung the big doors open. The Gleaner sat in the center of the dim interior, enormous and familiar, smelling of diesel and dried crop residue and the slightly sweet odor of old grease that Harold associated, in some part of his mind that ran below conscious thought, with productive work. He walked around the machine the way he always did before a day's work, a slow circuit, hands touching parts the way a man checks a boat before taking it out on water he respects, feeling for tension and clearance and condition with the sensitivity of long familiarity. The Gleaner L2 had been manufactured in 1976. It was painted in Gleaner's signature rust orange, though by 2022 the paint had faded and chipped to the point where the original color was more of a suggestion than a statement. The cab had a crack in the left side window that Harold had sealed with silicone in 2009 and never replaced. The air conditioning had stopped working in 1994 and Harold had replaced it with a small battery-powered fan that oscillated with a slight wobble, like a tired man nodding off in church. The machine had no GPS. No satellite connection. No onboard computer, no yield mapping software, no telematics system reporting its location to a server farm in Illinois. What it had was a 275 horsepower diesel engine rebuilt by Harold's own hands in 1998 and again in 2014, a threshing cylinder he had rebalanced with a level and a set of torque wrenches on a cold January morning, and a grain tank that held 240 bushels of wheat. He pulled up a metal stool beside the open engine compartment with his coffee and his flashlight and began the pre-harvest service. The first time Harold heard the name Derek Paulson, it was in the context of a complaint. Margaret Sorensen, who farmed 600 acres of dryland wheat 6 miles north of Harold's place and had opinions about most things, mentioned him at the grain elevator in August, in the tone she reserved for things that annoyed her. "That new fellow they hired to run the co-op's precision ag program," she said, filling out her scale ticket with the precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Paulson. From Omaha. Hasn't farmed a day in his life that I can determine, but he's very enthusiastic about data." Harold filed this away without comment. He knew the type. The county had been receiving them for 30 years, young men with degrees and ideas about farming assembled from spreadsheets and conference presentations. They came out with yield mapping software and satellite imagery, and they talked to farmers in meeting rooms at the extension office with the earnest confidence of people who had not yet been sufficiently embarrassed by reality. Some of them learned. Some of them didn't. Harold met Derek Paulson for the first time at the Dodge County Farm Bureau meeting in late August. Paulson was 37 years old, lean, with a neat beard and a flannel shirt pressed in a way that suggested it had never been worn in an actual field. He stood at a pull-down screen showing slides full of color-coded maps and yield data and efficiency curves. "What we're offering the growers in this county," Paulson was saying, with the smooth delivery of someone who had given this presentation many times, "is a fully integrated precision agriculture platform. The new Series X9 combines we're bringing in for the Harvest Co-op this fall have onboard yield sensors, variable rate control, and real-time connectivity to our central data platform. Every acre you harvest, we're capturing that data, soil variability, moisture content, yield by zone. It all feeds the system, and next year your prescriptions are that much more precise." Several farmers, the younger ones who had taken out large operating loans to upgrade equipment, leaned forward with the expressions of people hearing something they had already half decided to believe. Harold sat in the third row and drank his coffee. "What happens," he said, "when the pause had extended long enough to constitute an invitation, if the manufacturer pushes a software update during harvest?" Paulson turned toward him with the practiced patience of a presenter who is prepared for hostile questions. "Updates are scheduled outside of peak operational periods, Mr. Voss." Harold Voss. "Mr. Voss. The manufacturer's support team has protocols in place to ensure." "John Deere locked a man's combine in Kansas last harvest," said Margaret Sorensen from the second row, without looking up from the meeting agenda she had been annotating. "Software issue. Machine sat in the field for 2 days. That was an isolated incident." "Wasn't isolated to him," Margaret said, still without looking up. Paulson moved to the next slide. Harold looked at the efficiency chart and thought about the question it didn't answer: what happened in the years when the technology failed, and how those years figured into the average. After the meeting, as chairs were being folded and tables set up for the potluck, Paulson approached Harold with the slightly aggressive friendliness of someone who has decided to convert a skeptic. "I hear you're running a 76 Gleaner," he said. "That's right. At current wheat prices, the yield difference between a machine that age and a modern precision system could be significant. I'd be happy to run the numbers with you." "I know my numbers," Harold said. "Of course." Paulson shifted his coffee cup. "If you ever want to talk about participation in the Harvest Co-op." "I've got a machine," Harold said. "It runs. I can fix it myself when it doesn't." A pause. "I appreciate the offer." He moved toward the food table, where Margaret had set out the brisket, and the conversation ended. But it did not end with Paulson, who in the weeks that followed had apparently made Harold Voss and his Gleaner a particular example in his presentations, a case study in the old guard's resistance to progress, cited with a pitying humor that was becoming familiar in the county. "He called your combine a liability wrapped in nostalgia," Margaret reported at the grain elevator in September, with the directness she applied equally to good news and bad. Harold considered this. "He's not entirely wrong about the nostalgia part," he said, and went back to augering his grain. That evening, working alone in the machine shed with the overhead fluorescents throwing their flat white light across the concrete floor, he thought about the caption Paulson had written beneath the photograph of the old Gleaner on his slide, "The cost of legacy thinking." Harold tightened the last fitting on the cylinder cover and put down his wrench. He stood for a moment and looked at the machine. "You'll outlive the word," he said. The Gleaner said nothing, sitting in the fluorescent light with the calm indifference of a machine that had threshed more than 1,000,000 bushels of wheat and expected to thresh more. There was a story Harold's father Edwin used to tell, and Harold had heard it so many times that it had passed from narrative into something more like physical memory, as though he had been present for the events rather than hearing about them secondhand. It was 1973. Edwin was 44 years old and had been farming this ground for 22 years. The previous year had been one of the great wheat years in the county's history, good rains in April and May, a dry June for filling, yields running 12 to 15% above average. Edwin had finished that harvest with a balance in the operating account he hadn't seen in a decade, and the equipment dealer in Fremont had been calling with increasing enthusiasm about a new Allis-Chalmers Gleaner F, top of the line, $65,000 in 1973 money. The dealer, Walt Schaefer, was a good man. Honest in his dealings, knew the equipment, wouldn't tell you something was running right when it wasn't. But he had a machine to sell, and he sold it with the conviction of a man who believed in the product. Edwin had said no. He thanked Walt Schaefer, shook his hand, and drove his 1958 Minneapolis Moline combine back to the farm. He serviced it himself for the third consecutive winter, replacing the feeder chain, 2 drive belts, and a set of cylinder bars worn thin. Walt Schaefer had looked at him the way people looked at Edwin when he made decisions they didn't understand, a look that combined sympathy with a mild conviction that Edwin was missing something obvious about the nature of progress. 2 years later, the wheat price collapsed. Operating loans that had seemed so manageable at $4.50 a bushel became considerably less so at $2.90. Several farms in the county changed hands. Robert Hagel, who had bought the new Allis-Chalmers on credit and run 800 acres east of town with the confidence of a man who has borrowed on an optimistic forecast, had to sell 200 acres to service his debt. Walt Schaefer, who was essentially a decent man, looked uncomfortable whenever he saw Edwin after that. The Minneapolis Moline was paid for. Edwin had not gone anywhere. Harold had grown up understanding the logic of this story without being able to articulate it in economic terms. He understood it the way you understand music, not through analysis but through response. When he was old enough to ask real questions, he asked his father why he hadn't taken the loan. "Because I didn't know what the machine was doing when it was running," Edwin said. They were sitting in the cab of the Minneapolis Moline, in the middle of a field, waiting for the grain tank to fill. The sky was very big and very blue above them and the wheat went on to the horizon in every direction. "I could fix this machine because I understood it. I knew where every belt ran and every bearing sat and why the cylinder speed was what it was. Give me a machine I don't understand and it breaks, I'm helpless. And helpless in a wheat field in August is a very bad thing to be." Harold had thought about this for a long time. It was not a rejection of progress. It was a principle about the relationship between a man and his tools. The tool serves the man, not the other way around, and the measure of a tool was not only what it could do but what you could do with it when things went wrong. Edwin Voss died in 1991, at 62, from a heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday morning in early October while he was walking the east field checking the winter wheat emergence. He fell in the furrow and the ambulance took him away and he did not come back. Harold stood in the kitchen for a long time after the hospital called, looking out at the machine shed, trying to find the right way to understand what had happened. He kept the Gleaner L2. He had paid cash for it in 1989, the same year the Berlin Wall came down. He had operated it every harvest since. It had threshed more than 1,000,000 bushels of wheat for the Voss family. Harold knew where every belt ran and every bearing sat. He had once, during a difficult harvest in 2003, diagnosed a failing separator bearing by the change in vibration through the seat cushion, changed it in the field with parts from the cab toolbox, and been back in service in 40 minutes. He understood this machine. He had no plan to trade it in. There was a second thing Edwin had said, in a different conversation, that Harold returned to with increasing frequency as he got older. A neighbor named Craddock had lost his farm in the crisis of the mid-1980s, overextended, overleveraged, caught between rising interest rates and falling grain prices with no room to maneuver. Harold had asked his father why Craddock hadn't seen it coming. He had good equipment, Edwin said, not looking up from the corn he was shelling. He had good land. What he didn't have was the ability to be wrong and survive it. Everything he built depended on everything going right. He paused. When you build a system where everything has to go right, you've already lost. Because something always goes wrong. Harold had been 25 years old when Edwin said this. He had not fully understood it then. He understood it better every year since. By late September of 2022, Derek Paulson had signed up 14 growers for the Harvest Co-op program, which would bring 3 brand new John Deere X9 1100 combines into the county for the fall harvest. Each machine cost $670. Each had GPS guidance, real-time telematics, automated speed control, and a grain tank holding 380 bushels. They were formidable machines. The industrial peak of a particular vision of what a combine harvester should be. The monthly payments, at current interest rates and assuming average yields, were very manageable, as Paulson put it at the co-op presentation in September. He did not spend much time on what happened to that manageability if wheat prices moved significantly in the wrong direction, though that was something that had happened before in this county and would happen again. Harold Voss was not among the 14. This surprised no one who knew Harold. What was surprising was the degree to which Paulson had made Harold's refusal into a narrative. At the late September co-op meeting, the last big gathering before harvest season, Paulson's presentation included a photograph of a 1976 Gleaner L2 combine on a slide. Not Harold's specific machine, but close enough. The caption read, "The Cost of Legacy Thinking." Margaret Sorensen attended and reported its contents to Harold at the grain elevator 2 days later with the completeness of a court reporter. Harold listened and drank his coffee. "He's not entirely wrong about the yield losses," he said finally. "Modern machines leave less on the ground. I know that." He also said, Margaret continued, that some farmers in the county were running agricultural museums and that it was charming but not economically viable in the current environment. Harold put down his cup. Did he? He did. Harold was quiet. Outside, a truck pulled up to the elevator and a man got out and stretched his back and looked at the sky the way farmers look at the sky, reading it for information rather than pleasure. "You know what my grandfather used to say about people who told him something wasn't viable?" Harold said. "What?" He said, "I'll outlive the word." He picked up his coffee again. Old August. Came out here from Wisconsin with $60 and 2 mules. People told him plenty of things weren't viable. 100 years later, we're still here. Margaret nodded. She had met Old August once, when she was 7 and he was in his 80s. She remembered a man who seemed made of a denser material than ordinary people, compressed by time and weather into something that felt permanent, like good limestone. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," Harold said. "I'm going to go home and finish the service on the Gleaner. Harvests in 3 weeks." He drove home along the straight county road, past fields of standing wheat that caught the late September light and turned it gold. He thought about Paulson's caption, "The Cost of Legacy Thinking," and about what it revealed. Not malice. Just a failure of imagination. An inability to picture a world in which the new thing failed and the old thing kept going. Harold had spent 40 years picturing exactly that world. He had built his operation around it. The parts shelf. The paid-off equipment. The savings account that covered 4 years of operating costs without a crop, which was 2 years more than his banker thought was necessary and 2 years less than Old August would have considered sufficient. He thought about his son David, who understood code and systems and dependencies in ways Harold did not. David would understand, perhaps better than Paulson, exactly why a system that required external connectivity to function was a system with an exploitable failure mode. Harold made a note to call him that evening. He drove past the last field and turned into his lane, and the machine shed was visible ahead, and the Gleaner was inside it, waiting. The harvest of 2022 began on the 3rd of October, 10 days later than average, the result of a wet September that had kept wheat moisture above the elevator's preferred range for the first 3 weeks of the month. Harold watched the weather with the attention of a man whose livelihood depends on understanding a 7-day forecast and its limitations. He watched the morning skies and the evening clouds and the way the northwest wind came in the afternoons. He consulted the National Weather Service and compared it against what the fields themselves were telling him about soil moisture and plant condition. On October 2nd, he walked the east field in the early morning, moving slowly through the standing wheat with his hands at his sides, feeling the stalks, testing the heads between his fingers. The grain had dried nicely in 4 days of clear weather. Morning humidity was down. He went back to the house, looked at the 7-day forecast, looked at his moisture meter reading from the previous afternoon, and made his calculation. Tomorrow, he told the kitchen. He poured another coffee and went out to do the final pre-harvest check on the Gleaner. The John Deere X9 1100s had arrived in the county the previous week on transport trailers from the dealer's yard in Fremont. Harold had seen them on the highway, enormous green machines that dwarfed anything else on the road, their headers disassembled and loaded separately, each combined taking up the full width of a legal wide load permit. They were impressive. He did not dispute that. They were the expression of a particular vision of what a combine harvester could be, built to an extreme of capability and complexity that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. Harold had watched them go by and thought about ground pressure and what a machine that size would do to the soil structure on the soft corners of his fields after rain. Then he had gone back to his machine shed and replaced the worn guide shoes on his cutting header, which was a job that needed doing regardless of what he thought about other people's equipment. The first day of harvest, Harold was in the field by 6:30. He waited in the cab while the dew lifted, watching the sky, watching the field, watching the clock he had installed himself in 1994 because the original had stopped working and a new one from the dealer was not worth the cost. At 7:15 he decided the conditions were right and he lowered the header and began. The sound of the Gleaner at work was something Harold had lived with for 30 years. It was not something he heard consciously anymore, it was something he listened to, continuously, the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. The engine's deep diesel rhythm. The rasp of the reel against the standing crop. The hiss of grain through the elevator. The steady drone of the threshing cylinder. He monitored all of it simultaneously without effort, a background signal against which anything unusual registered immediately. He worked the east field through the morning, running the parallel passes with the precision of a man who had done this for decades and whose sense of the field was accurate to within a few feet without GPS, from the accumulated knowledge of where the boundaries were, where the tile lines ran, where the low spot in the southwest corner collected water after rain and needed to be approached from a particular angle. By noon he had done 110 acres. He drove to the bin site, augured out the grain, and ate the sandwich Margaret Sorensen had sent over with her youngest son that morning, on the grounds that Harold ate badly during harvest. This was true. He sat in the cab with the engine off, looking at the field, listening to the market report on the county AM station. Soft red winter wheat was trading at $8.45 a bushel at the Fremont elevator. High side of recent history. This harvest had genuine significance. He started the engine and went back to work. 3 evenings before the harvest began, Harold had called his son David. David answered on the second ring, which meant he was at his desk, which meant it was probably 9 or 10 o'clock Omaha time and he was still working. He was 38 years old, lean like his grandfather Edwin, with Edwin's directness and a mind that Harold recognized as similar to his own but oriented toward different problems, toward code and systems and the architecture of how software fit together. "I've been thinking about something," Harold said, after the initial exchange about the weather and David's wife Linda and the grandchildren Harold saw twice a year. "That new equipment they're bringing into the county for harvest. The John Deere X9s. Do you know anything about the software they run?" There was a brief silence. "Not specifically." "Why?" Harold told him about the meeting in August. About Paulson's presentation. About the slide with the photograph of the old Gleaner and the caption. David listened without interrupting, which was a quality Harold had always valued in him. "The question I asked him," Harold said, "was what happens if they push a software update during harvest." He didn't have a good answer. Another silence. "That's actually a real concern," David said, and his voice had shifted into the register it took when he was thinking seriously about something. "Any system that depends on remote connectivity for core functions has that vulnerability. If the update process isn't bulletproof, and software update processes are almost never bulletproof at scale, you're looking at exactly what you're describing. Machines going down simultaneously because a code change propagated badly." "Has that happened? With other kinds of machines? Cars, medical devices, industrial equipment?" "It happens more than companies like to admit. Usually in controlled environments it's manageable. In a harvest window with a rain forecast," David stopped. "That's a different problem." "That's what I thought," Harold said. They talked for another 20 minutes, about systems and dependencies and the specific vulnerability of things that could not function without external permission. Harold did not understand all of it, but he understood enough, understood that what he had suspected from a farmer's instinct, David was confirming from an engineer's analysis. "Dad," David said, near the end of the call. "I've been thinking about coming up this fall. Not for harvest, I know you don't need help during harvest, but maybe November. I'd like to see the fields before winter." Harold was quiet for a moment. David had not come in November for several years. He had his own life in Omaha, his own family, his own demands. Harold had never pushed. "The door's open," he said. "It always is." "I know," David said. "That's why I haven't been worried about waiting." After he hung up, Harold sat in the kitchen for a while looking at the dark fields through the window. He thought about what it meant to have a son who understood both the land and the code, who had grown up on the one and built a career on the other. He thought about what that particular combination of knowledge might eventually be worth to a farm that was going to face, in the coming decades, challenges that neither Edwin nor old August could have imagined. He went to bed. Harvest was in 3 days. The software failure happened on October 5th, which was the third day of harvest, at 7:22 in the morning. It did not happen on Harold Voss's machine. The Gleaner had no software to fail. John Deere's agricultural operations software had received an automatic update at 7:00 a.m. Central Time on October 5th. The update addressed a cybersecurity vulnerability identified by the company's internal security team 2 weeks earlier. It had been tested in the company's development environment and on a limited number of machines in controlled conditions. What had not been adequately tested was the interaction between the new security patch and the guidance module firmware on machines operating in harvest mode at the specific combination of crop moisture and ambient temperature that characterized early October in the Great Plains. The interaction caused a state flag error that the machine's safety protocols interpreted as an unresolved sensor fault. The safety protocols responded by locking the machine into a safe state, headers raised, ground drive disengaged, engine at idle. The machine stopped. All 3 of Dodge County's X9 1100s stopped at approximately the same moment, in 3 different fields, in the middle of a pass, with their operator displays showing an error code none of the operators had ever seen. System fault, contact dealer. The dealers were contacted. The dealers contacted John Deere's technical support line. The support line was, at that moment, receiving approximately 1,400 calls from across the country and Canada from operators of late-model John Deere equipment that had simultaneously stopped working. The hold time was considerable. Harold learned about this at 8:15 when his cell phone rang. It was Carl Henrichs, who farmed 200 acres west of town and had been among the first to sign up for the Pulsing Co-op program. "Harold." Carl's voice had the quality of someone maintaining calm over a situation threatening calm. "You hear about the Deere machines?" "No. They're all down. Computer thing. Some kind of update. All 3 of ours stopped this morning. Ed Briggs's machine stopped, Mike Schulte's machine stopped. I'm hearing it's the same story across the whole region." Harold was in the cab of the Gleaner, 40 feet into a new pass on the south field. He brought the machine to a stop and set the parking brake. Through the cracked cab window he could hear the Gleaner's engine ticking at idle, the familiar sound of a machine waiting for instructions. "How long?" he asked. "Nobody knows. Deere says they're working on it. Maybe 24 hours, but nobody believes that. Technical support can't even get to most of the calls yet." Harold looked at the sky. The forecast rain was coming Thursday. Today was Wednesday. There were 75 acres on his south field, 80 more on the east neighbor's ground under custom harvesting contract, and a man named Gordon Ferris 7 miles south with 200 acres standing that needed to come in before the weekend. "All right," he said. "All right? That's all you've got?" "I'll get back to you," Harold said. "Let me know when you hear more." He hung up and looked at the field again. He thought about what he knew. The forecast was reliable, the front was large and well-defined, and the National Weather Service had been tracking it for a week. Rain Thursday, possibly heavy, through Friday. Wheat still standing by Friday evening would deteriorate significantly. The window was today and tomorrow, plus whatever Thursday morning allowed before the front arrived. He thought about what he had. A machine that was running and that he knew how to keep running. 600 gallons of diesel in the bulk tank. The parts he needed sitting on shelves in his shed. He thought about what other people had. Machines that were not running, and a support line fielding 1,400 calls. He disengaged the parking brake, lowered the header, and began to move. By noon on October 5th, the scope of the problem was clear. It was not just the 3 co-op machines. Every late-model John Deere in the county with the affected firmware version had stopped, every machine purchased in the past 3 years, and many older machines that had received previous updates loading the now vulnerable module. In Dodge County alone, 11 combines, 7 self-propelled sprayers, 3 grain carts. In the entire recorded annals of Dodge County farming, going back to the first township meeting records in 1872, there had never been a morning when the majority of the county's harvest equipment simultaneously and completely stopped working. There had been breakdowns, bad weather, fires, and the catastrophic drought of 1988 when men harvested 20 bushels an acre where they had budgeted 60. But those were individual events, or natural events, or events that developed slowly and allowed for some response. This was instantaneous. A machine working perfectly at 7:21 a.m. showing system fault at 7:22 a.m., without warning, in the middle of a field. Derek Paulson spent the morning on his cell phone in the co-op parking lot, first with John Deere's regional manager, then with the technical support center, then with the regional sales director, then with the regional manager again. He paced a rectangular path between his truck and the building entrance, and people who passed by reported that he looked increasingly unlike the composed presenter who had stood before them in meeting rooms over the past months. Carl Henricks drove his stop combine to the edge of his field, parked it in the wheat stubble, and sat in the cab looking at the error message on the display screen. Then he got out and stood at the edge of the field looking at the standing wheat in the way farmers look at crops they cannot harvest, not with sentimentality but with a specific, calibrated anguish that comes from understanding exactly what is at stake per acre. Margaret Sorensen was characteristically practical. Her 2019 Gleaner S97, more modern than Harold's but 2 firmware generations behind the affected version, had not received the problematic update. She started her machine and kept working. But her ground alone was not enough to address the county's accumulated problem. By 1 o'clock, a loose conference of affected farmers had gathered at the co-op, sitting in pickup trucks in the parking lot and standing in small groups, talking on phones and to each other. The consensus was grim. John Deere's technical team was working on a remediation patch, but the scale of the problem was larger than anticipated. They hoped to have a solution deployed within 48 hours. 48 hours. Thursday and into Friday. The rain was coming Thursday afternoon. Harold Voss was not at the co-op parking lot. Harold Voss was in the south field, making passes. By 2 o'clock, Harold had completed the south field, 75 acres, augured the grain into his bins, and driven the Gleaner to the Henricks farm 2 miles west, where Carl had 340 acres standing and no machine to cut them with. He had called Carl from the cab that morning, and the conversation had been brief. "Can you get to me?" Carl had asked. "After I finish my south. This afternoon." Carl had not said thank you, because Carl Henricks was not a man who said thank you in the middle of an operational crisis. What he said was, "I'll have the grain cart gassed up," which was the agricultural equivalent of a deeply felt expression of gratitude. The Gleaner arrived at Henricks West Field at 2:15. Harold pulled through the gate, did a slow circuit of the field edge, reading the crop, the height of the standing wheat, the color of the heads, the way the rows lay in the light southwest wind. He was estimating moisture content by eye and feel, the way he had done for decades, cross-checking against his morning meter readings and what the afternoon sun had had time to do since. The crop was ready. It needed to come out of the field before Thursday. He lowered the header and began. Carl drove the grain cart alongside when the Gleaner's tank was getting full, and Harold engaged the auger and transferred grain while still moving, a coordination he and Carl had practiced enough times over the years that it had become second nature, a kind of slow, diesel-powered dance that allowed continuous harvesting without stopping to haul to the bins. They worked through the afternoon without speaking more than was necessary. The light changed as the sun moved toward the southwest, turning the wheat golden then amber, and the Gleaner moved through it methodically, cutting its 22-foot swath with the measured confidence of a machine that had been doing this for 30 years. At 4 o'clock Harold took a 15-minute break at the field edge, pouring coffee from his thermos and eating half a sandwich Carl's wife had brought out in a Tupperware container. He sat on the running board of the Gleaner and looked at the field, at what he had cut and what remained and what Thursday's mathematics required, and did the arithmetic in his head. At 5 o'clock, his phone rang. "Margaret. The Ferris family called me," she said. "Gordon's got 200 acres standing south of 32. His machine is down. His neighbor's machine is down. He's looking at the rain forecast and he sounds," a pause. "He sounds the way people sound when things are getting serious." Harold looked at the field ahead. He had made perhaps 80 of Carl's 340 acres. "I can't get there tonight." I told him that. I told him I can get there early tomorrow morning for a few hours before my own ground needs attention. "Tell him I'll be there by noon tomorrow if I work Carl's ground tonight by lights." "Harold, you don't have to." "I've got lights. The ground's dry enough. It's fine." He had harvested by headlights before, more times than he could count, in the years when the weather closed the window and the only option was to keep going. The Gleaner's headlights were adequate, and Harold's ability to navigate his fields by memory and instinct was sufficient, and a certain stubbornness in the face of physical inconvenience was, as Edwin had been fond of saying, part of the job description. He worked Carl Henrich's fields through the evening and into the night. The temperature dropped after sunset and the dew came back, which raised crop moisture and meant he had to watch the machine's performance more carefully, occasionally slowing to allow the cylinder clearance to adjust to changing conditions. He ate the rest of the sandwich, drank coffee from his thermos, and kept moving. The stars were very clear above the Nebraska plain and the Gleaner's headlights swept through the standing wheat in the dark like a lighthouse beam, steady and deliberate, cutting and threshing and moving on. At midnight he parked the Gleaner at the edge of the field, 220 acres done, drove Carl's truck to the farmhouse, and slept 4 hours on Carl's couch with his boots on, because it was not worth going home and coming back. While Harold slept on Carl Henrich's couch, the county was having a different kind of night. John Deere's technical support team, working from the company's headquarters in Moline, Illinois, had confirmed the problem. The security patch had caused the state flag error, the safety system had locked the machines, and the fix required a counter patch that would clear the fault state and restore normal operation. The counter patch had been developed. It was in testing. But deploying a software update to thousands of machines across multiple countries was not a simple operation. The patch had to be validated, staged, pushed through the telematics network to each machine, which required that each machine's cellular module be functional, that the signal be adequate, that the deployment protocol complete successfully. The deployment was showing lower success rates than the technical team had hoped. Some machines were in poor signal areas. Some had secondary connectivity issues. Some required additional manual steps. The company's statement expressed regret for the disruption and confidence in a timely resolution. It did not mention that timely in this context appeared to mean Thursday afternoon at the earliest, which was when the front with its rain was expected to arrive in the eastern Nebraska prairie. Derek Paulson had been on the phone until 11 at night. He had conveyed, with increasing directness, the specific agricultural mathematics of the situation: wheat at $8.45 a bushel, 200 acres per affected grower, rain in 36 hours, quality degradation beginning at moisture content above 14.5%. He had conveyed that farmers in this county had made significant financial commitments based on representations about the reliability of this technology. He had conveyed that he personally considered the company's response inadequate to the severity of the situation. The person at the national level had said all the things that people at national levels say when operations have gone badly wrong. Paulson ended the call at 11:15 and sat in his truck in the co-op parking lot, looking at the dark fields visible beyond the grain elevator's lights. He thought about the presentation 3 weeks ago. The slide with the photograph of the old Gleaner. The caption he had written, "The Cost of Legacy Thinking." He thought about Harold Voss, who had asked the right question in the meeting and been given a reassuring non-answer, and who was at this moment, Paulson had heard from Carl Henrichs, somewhere in a dark field, by headlights, doing the work that $40,000 worth of monthly combined payments could not currently do. He sat with this for a long time. Then he drove home. Harold was back in the field by 4:30 Thursday morning, while the sky was still fully dark and the temperature had dropped into the low 40s. He knew, from 30 years of watching weather in this county, that the front would arrive sometime between noon and 3 in the afternoon. He had a window of 8 to 10 hours. He had 120 acres of Carl Henrichs ground still to do, and Gordon Ferris's 200 acres south of Route 32. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Gleaner L2, working optimally in good wheat, could do approximately 25 to 30 acres per hour. 120 plus 200 equaled 320 acres. At 25 acres per hour, that was nearly 13 hours. He had 8 to 10. He was not going to get it all done. He thought about this with the clear-headed realism of a man who had been solving agricultural problems with insufficient resources for 40 years. The first step was always to be honest about the gap. Wishful thinking in harvest was how you made decisions that looked good until they didn't. He could not do it alone. That was the fact. He called Margaret Sorensen at 4:15, while it was still dark. "I can give you until 10, Margaret said immediately, before he had finished explaining. "I need to be back on my own ground by 10, but between now and then I'm yours." "Start with the Ferris ground," Harold said. "Gordon's got a bigger problem than Carl." "I know Gordon's ground. I'll take the west side, the long runs. More efficient." "Good. I'll be at Ferris's by 9:30 if things go right." "And if they don't?" Then we do what we can, Harold said, and we're honest about what we didn't. He put the phone on the seat and lowered the header and drove into the dark wheat. The first light came at 5:45, a gray seeping at the eastern horizon. Harold had done 60 more acres by then. He worked steadily, monitoring the machine by sound and feel the way he always did, alert to anything unusual against the familiar background of operational noise. The feeder house chain running smooth. The cylinder hum unchanged. The elevator doing its steady work. Everything as it should be. By 8 o'clock the sky had the look he associated with incoming fronts, a high, flat overcast moving in from the northwest, dulling the light without blocking it, the kind of sky that meant business in the next several hours. Harold adjusted his estimate of the front's arrival from 2 o'clock to noon. He picked up his pace. The John Deere technical team began deploying the remediation patch at 8:47 Thursday morning. Deployment succeeded on approximately 73% of affected machines on the first attempt. The remaining machines required direct manual intervention, a dealer technician connecting a diagnostic cable to the machine's service port and executing the patch locally, bypassing the cellular network entirely. In Dodge County, 3 of the 11 stopped combines received the patch successfully through the network and were running again by 9:30. The remaining 8 required manual intervention, and the dealer's service team from Fremont, 2 technicians in 1 truck, were working through them in order of geographic proximity. The 3 Co-op X9s were not geographically close to each other. 2 of them were accessible by mid-morning. The third, on the southwest side of the county, in a low-signal area, could not receive the network patch and had to wait for the technicians to drive there. It did not resume harvesting until 11:40. Harold finished Carl Henrich's remaining 120 acres at 9:50 and was driving the Gleaner south on the county road toward the Ferris farm when his phone rang. Carl. Harold. 3 machines in the county just came back. I'm hearing more will follow through the morning. Good, Harold said. Harold. A pause. You didn't have to work all night. Your grain needed to come in. I know, but... Carl, Harold said, gently. It's done. Get to your bins. He arrived at the Ferris farm at 10:15. Gordon Ferris was standing at the gate of the north field, watching Margaret Sorensen's Gleaner S97 working the far end of the field in the morning light. Gordon was 63 years old, a lean, weathered man who had farmed this ground for 35 years, and he had the look of someone who had spent the last 20 hours managing an extreme level of agricultural anxiety. He looked at Harold's approaching Gleaner and then at Harold as Harold climbed down from the cab. I heard you worked Carl's place all night, Gordon said. He needed it. John Deere sending technicians. My machine might be back by early afternoon. Harold looked at the field. Margaret had done perhaps 60 of the 200 acres on the west side. His own Gleaner, faster than the rain but not faster than the clock, would bring it to perhaps 150 if things went well. Then I'll do what I can until yours comes back, Harold said. How's the crop? Tested it at 7 this morning. 13.8. Harold nodded. Let me get started. He drove the Gleaner through the gate and lowered the header and began. Derek Paulson arrived at the Ferris farm at 11:15. He had been driving the county since 8 in the morning, checking on affected growers, getting updates on which machines were back. He had drafted a message to co-op members that he had written and deleted 3 times. The right language between honesty and legal exposure was proving elusive. He pulled his truck up to the gate of the south field and got out and stood there watching Harold Voss's 1976 Gleaner work its way through Gordon Ferris's standing wheat. He watched it for a long time without moving. The machine was not impressive by any standard metric of agricultural efficiency. It cut a 22-foot swath where the modern machines cut 45 feet. Its speed was moderate, roughly 4 miles per hour through the standing crop. Its grain handling was audible in ways that modern enclosed systems were not. You could hear the whole mechanical sequence of it, the reel, the feeder, the cylinder, the elevator, working in the open air. But it was moving. It was cutting. It was doing the irreducible thing a combine harvester exists to do, separate grain from plant and put the grain somewhere useful before the rain comes. Gordon Ferris came out of the machine shed carrying 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Paulson. Machine's not back yet? Paulson asked. Technician's on his way. Should be here by 1. Paulson looked at the sky, which had taken on the pewter overcast of an approaching front. Rain's going to be early. Harold said noon. The forecast says 1 to 3. Harold doesn't use the forecast for timing. He watches the sky. Gordon drank his coffee. He's usually right within an hour. They stood at the gate and watched the Gleaner. It turned at the end of the pass and came back on the next cut, steady, methodical, leaving a clean stubble behind it. Harold was visible in the cab, a still figure at the wheel, moving with the machine through the wheat. How long has he had that machine? Paulson asked. Bought it in '89. But it's a 76. Been working in this county since before you were born. Paulson was quiet for a moment. Does he ever think about upgrading? Gordon looked at him, not hostilely, but in the way people look when deciding how to phrase a correction. Harold's thought about everything. He just thinks about it differently than you do. Paulson looked at his coffee cup. I used a photograph of a machine like that in a presentation last month. To make a point about legacy equipment being a liability. I know, Gordon said. Everybody knows. It got back to Harold. A pause. Harold didn't say much about it. That's how you know it registered. The problem with calling something a liability, Gordon continued, setting his mug on the gate post, is you have to wait and see what it is when things go wrong. Fast forward 2 days from that presentation and this is what liability looks like. He gestured at the field, at the cut wheat on Harold's side of the gate, the standing wheat beyond. Yesterday, when my machine stopped and Harold's kept going, that's not nostalgia. That's insurance. The first drops fell at 12:47. Harold had been watching the sky since 11:30, monitoring the advance of the overcast, the shift in wind direction from southwest to west-northwest that told him the front was organizing ahead of schedule. He had been running faster than he would have preferred, pushing the Gleaner toward its practical limit, because the mathematics of remaining acres and approaching rain were not working in his favor and he knew it. At 12:45, 2 minutes before the first drops, Gordon Ferris's combine came back to life. The John Deere technician had connected the diagnostic cable to the service port and executed the manual patch installation. The machine cleared its fault state. The operator display returned to normal. Gordon was in the cab before the technician had finished packing his tools. At 12:47, it began to rain. Harold brought the Gleaner to a stop and raised the header. He sat in the cab for a moment listening to the rain begin on the metal roof, a tentative patter that grew quickly into something more serious. Through the cracked window he could see Gordon Ferris's combine moving in the field to his south, cutting the last 40 acres that Harold hadn't reached, the machine's lights on in the gray rain light, its guidance system holding it on a precise line through the crop. Harold watched the newer machine work. It was faster than his. It cut a wider swath. Its grain handling was cleaner and more precise, and it was running because a technician had driven from Fremont with a laptop and a cable, and had arrived in time, and because the 40 acres Harold had been unable to finish were few enough that Gordon's machine could handle them in the window before the rain got heavy. 40 minutes. That was the margin. He did not feel superior to the newer machine. He felt only the quiet satisfaction of having done the work in front of him, with the tools he had, in the time available. That was enough. That was always what farming asked. He drove the Gleaner to the field edge, parked it, and climbed down. The rain was coming steadily now, a proper October rain with the cold of the front behind it, and Harold turned his face up into it for a moment the way a man does when he is genuinely tired and genuinely grateful that something is over. Gordon Ferris pulled up in his truck 20 minutes later, when the last of his ground was done. I've got 140 acres in the bin, Harold told him. You got the rest. Gordon looked at the rain. The 60 you didn't finish, worst case it takes a 3-cent quality discount. I can live with that. He paused. Harold. Without you here last night and this morning. You'd have waited for your machine to come back, Harold said. It came back. It came back 40 minutes before the rain. Harold acknowledged this with a slight nod. That's not a margin I like, Gordon said. 40 minutes. No. What do I owe you? Harold had thought about this on the drive over that morning, between the field and here, between the work and the end of the work. Standard custom harvesting rate was around $18 an acre. 140 acres was $2,500. He had worked 12 hours through the night and 6 hours this morning and he was tired in the bone-deep way that only harvest makes you tired. Your boy, Harold said. Marcus. He's 17? Just turned. I want you to send him over one afternoon this winter. I'll show him how the Gleaner works. How to check the belts, how to set the cylinder, how to tell by the sound of the machine whether something is about to go wrong. Harold paused. These machines are all going to have computers in them. I know that. But Marcus should understand what's underneath the computer. He should know what the machine is actually doing, so that when the computer fails, and computers fail, he knows what to look for. Gordon looked at him for a long moment. That's all you want? That's what I want. Gordon nodded slowly. I'll send him over. They stood in the rain looking at the field. Behind them, the Gleaner sat at the edge of the stubble, orange and rust-stained, the fan oscillating in the empty cab, patient in the rain. Derek Paulson was still at the Ferris farm when Harold parked the Gleaner and climbed down from the cab. He had stayed through the rain, standing by his truck with his collar turned up, watching Gordon's combine finish the last 40 acres. When Gordon drove up and got out and the field was done, Paulson was still there. Harold walked back toward the gate and found him there, and for a moment the two men regarded each other in the way men regard each other when something unspoken has shifted between them. I heard you worked all night on Henrik's place, Paulson said. Needed doing. Then you came here. Gordon needed it. Paulson was quiet. He was looking at the Gleaner, sitting in the rain at the field edge, the orange paint faded, the cab window cracked, the whole machine carrying the dignity of something that has been used hard and well for a very long time. I said some things, Paulson said. At the co-op meeting. About legacy equipment. He stopped. I was wrong about what I was using it as an example of. Harold looked at him. This was not the kind of statement he was accustomed to hearing from men in Paulson's position. You weren't wrong about efficiency, Harold said. Your machines are more efficient than mine. Under normal conditions. That's true. Normal conditions. Paulson said it carefully, fitting the phrase into a space in his understanding where it hadn't previously sat. Everything works in normal conditions, Harold said. The question is what works when conditions aren't normal. And the thing about farming is that conditions are never normal for very long. Paulson nodded slowly. The 40 minutes. If your machine hadn't been here, you'd have been 40 minutes short. 3 to 4 cents a bushel quality discount on 60 acres. $6,000. And that's just Ferris. A pause. Ed Langer doesn't have anybody to help him. He's got 150 acres standing and his machine might be back tomorrow morning. Harold had heard about Ed Langer. 68 years old. Farming alone since his wife Ruth had died in the spring, 39 years of marriage and then nothing, and the farm still there needing to be farmed. His son Michael lived in Lincoln, too far to come on short notice. Ed had signed up for the co-op program because the economics made sense and because he had trusted the technology. Where's Ed's ground? Harold asked. East of 15, south side of the highway. Harold looked at the sky. The rain was steady but not heavy, a soaking rain that would run through the night into tomorrow morning. By tomorrow afternoon it would be done, and then the question was how much quality Ed's 150 acres would lose in 20 to 24 hours of wet weather. His ground will be all right, Harold said. Ed's on sandy loam, east side of that section. Drains fast. He's probably already at 13.5 or better. Rain won't hurt him much if it stops by tomorrow afternoon. How do you know his moisture content? I don't, Harold said, but I know what sandy loam does in this kind of weather. And I know what the weather has been for the past month. And I've been watching that piece of ground for 40 years. He paused. If I'm wrong, he might need to dry some loads at the elevator. But I don't think I'm wrong. The rain fell around them steadily, and the smell of wet earth and cut wheat was very strong. Can I ask you something? Paulson said. You can ask. Why don't you upgrade? Not the financial argument, you could afford a modern machine. You've been farming profitably for decades. Why do you keep the Gleaner? Harold considered the question. It was a genuine question now, different from the rhetorical version it might have been before the past 2 days. Because I understand it, he said. Every part of it. If something goes wrong, I know what went wrong and I know how to fix it. I've never been in a field with that machine and not been able to solve the problem. He paused. Your machine went down because someone in Moline pushed a button. I don't have anything against John Deere. It's a good company and it makes good machines. But there's something uncomfortable about the idea that a decision made in a building in Illinois can stop my harvest on a Wednesday morning in Nebraska. The dependency, Paulson said. That's what you mean. That's what I mean. The machine. The software. The data platform. The connectivity. It's all adding intermediaries between the farmer and the work. That machine does what I tell it. Nobody in Illinois has a say in it. And that's worth something that doesn't show up in an efficiency comparison. Paulson stood in the rain. I'm going to call John Deere's regional people this week. I want to talk about an emergency manual override, a hardware procedure an operator can execute without cellular connectivity, without calling the support line. It shouldn't require a technician and a 2-hour drive. That would be useful, Harold said. And I'm going to change how I present the co-op program. Not just efficiency metrics. Risk factors. Dependency factors. What the system looks like when something goes wrong. He paused. I'm going to stop using photographs of old equipment as examples of failure. Harold looked at him. The man was genuine, working through something true about a mistake he had made, and not taking shortcuts in the reckoning. Appreciated, Harold said. They shook hands in the rain, beside the gate to Gordon Ferris's field, with the 1976 Gleaner L2 sitting 50 feet away and the smell of wheat and rain and turned earth all around them. Paulson walked to his truck, stopped at the door, and turned back. Do you need help with anything? When Ed Langer's ground dries out. Come by Friday afternoon, Harold said. We'll take the truck out to Ed's and see what he needs. Paulson blinked. You'd let me help? You're here. And you know how to work, I assume. I grew up on a farm in the Panhandle, Paulson said quietly. Before my family sold it. Harold nodded. He had not known that. It explained something, the ease with which Paulson stood in the rain without appearing to notice it, the way he moved near machinery, the fluency of a man who had once known this life and had it taken from him by forces beyond his control. Friday afternoon, Harold said. We'll see what Ed needs. Paulson got in his truck and drove away down the wet county road. Harold stood at the gate for a moment longer, looking at the field, at the cut stubble on the near side, at the rain coming down on it, at the sky moving overhead. Then he climbed back into the Gleaner and drove it slowly toward the Ferris farmyard, the engine ticking steadily, the machine carrying him home through the rain. That night, Harold sat in the kitchen after supper and looked at the rain falling in the dark beyond the window. He was tired in the way that only harvest makes you tired, the bone-deep exhaustion of sustained attention and physical work under time pressure. He knew it would resolve with sleep. But he was not ready for sleep yet. He was thinking about what Edwin had said, not the story of the Alice Chalmers, but the other thing, the thing about Craddock. When you build a system where everything has to go right, you've already lost. Because something always goes wrong. Paulson had not built the John Deere system. He had not written the software or designed the connectivity platform or made the decision to push his security patch during harvest season. He had simply sold something, in good faith, without fully accounting for the ways it could fail, because the industry he worked in had not built honest accounting of failure into the sales pitch, and because he had not yet been given a reason to demand it. The machine shed outside the window held the answer Paulson had been missing. Not in the Gleaner itself, the Gleaner was just a machine, a good one, but just a machine. The answer was in the logic of the shelves. The parts stock for failures that hadn't happened yet. The savings account size for years that hadn't come. The equipment paid for in cash so that no one else had a claim on it when the market turned. That logic was not pessimism. It was not fear. It was the acknowledgement that the world was going to be difficult, and that the time to prepare for difficulty was before it arrived, not after. Edwin had learned it from August. August had learned it from Nebraska itself, from the Dust Bowl years that had scoured the pride out of men who had thought the good years would continue indefinitely. Harold thought about Friday and Ed Langer's ground. He thought about Derek Paulson growing up on a farm in the Panhandle that his family had eventually lost. He thought about what it meant to be that man, to have grown up with the knowledge of this work in this land and to have had it taken from you, and to spend your career now selling solutions to people who still had what you had lost. He went to bed. Outside, the rain continued, steady and patient, doing what rain does. The rain stopped at 11:40 Friday morning. Harold was in the machine shed by noon, doing the post-harvest service on the Gleaner, cleaning the cylinder, checking the concaves, lubricating the feeder house chain, inspecting the header belts for wear. His hands knew this work so thoroughly that his mind moved through other things while his fingers checked clearances and his eyes assessed wear patterns. He was thinking about Ed Langer. Ed was 68 years old, careful and methodical, a man who kept good records and maintained his equipment conscientiously. Harold had known him for 30 years, had bought corn seed from him one season and had borrowed his post-hole digger the summer he put in the new fence line along the west boundary. They were not close friends, in the way of men who live in the same county and share the same profession. They were something more functional than friendship and less formal than acquaintance. They understood each other in the shorthand of shared circumstance. Since Ruth had died in April, Ed had the quality of a man managing a weight heavier than the visible work in front of him. Harold had noticed it at the elevator in the summer, a slight slowing of response, a pause before ordinary questions, the way a man moves when he is carrying something inside him that has no practical solution. Harold had not said anything about it, because there was nothing useful to say. He had made sure to stop and talk when he saw Ed, to linger a few minutes longer than he otherwise might have. Small things. Ed's son Michael had driven up from Lincoln on Wednesday evening when the machine went down, had spent the night, had gone back Thursday morning when Ed insisted there was nothing to do but wait. Harold called Ed at 12:30. Ed answered on the second ring, and the quality of his voice told Harold the machine was still down. "Dealer's supposed to be here by 2, Ed said. He had the contained flatness of a man who has been managing worry for 2 days and is getting toward the end of his capacity for it. "I'll be there by 3, Harold said. "Margaret too, if she can make it." Harold. "Ed. I'll be there by 3. He called Margaret, who said she could give an hour. He finished the service on the Gleaner, ate lunch, loaded the portable auger into the truck, and drove out to Ed Langer's farm along the county road east of 15, with the sky clearing fast behind the front and the fields already beginning to show the lighter color of grain drying in the afternoon wind. Derek Paulson was already there. He had arrived at 2:15, apparently, and had spent the time helping Ed move grain bins into position and checking the fuel in the auger tractor. When Harold pulled into the yard, Paulson was in the machine shed with Ed, going over the morning's moisture readings. 13.2, Ed was saying. "Rain came in at 13.6 and it's only come down a little." "What does the elevator need for full price?" Paulson asked. 13.5 or below. "So the rain didn't hurt you?" "Not on quality." Ed looked up and saw Harold in the doorway. Something shifted in his face, a slight releasing of tension, the way a room changes when someone you were waiting for arrives. "Harold said you'd be coming," he said to Paulson. "He invited me," Paulson said, with the slight awkwardness of a man navigating the experience of not being the one in charge. "Good," Ed said. "I can use the help. Dealer says the machine will be ready by 3:30. At 3:30, the John Deere technician drove away after completing the manual patch installation, and 3 men were waiting in the field, Ed in his combine, Harold in his truck ready to haul grain, and Derek Paulson on the seat of Ed's grain cart tractor, having received a 10-minute orientation from Harold with the brisk directness of someone who has confidence in the learner and limited time for the lesson. Paulson had grown up on a farm. He knew how to run a tractor. He was fine. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. The northwest wind that followed the front was dry and strong, and you could almost watch the field drying as they went, the moisture dropping in the warm airflow. By 7:30 Ed Langer's 150 acres were in the bin. They stood in the farmyard in the fading light with the satisfied tiredness of people who have finished something that needed to be finished. Ed made coffee. They drank it standing in the yard, not talking much, watching the last of the light go out of the sky to the west. After a while Ed said, "I want to ask you something," and looked at Harold. "Go ahead." "Your machine. The Gleaner. How long can you keep running it?" "As long as I can get parts and keep the engine in it. Another 20 years if I maintain it right. I've got drawings for most of the fabricated parts, I can machine them myself if I have to." "You machine your own parts?" "Some of them. There's a lathe in the back of the shed. Edwin put it in 1962. Harold paused. "The combine doesn't know I'm not from the factory." Ed was quiet for a moment. "My father had a lathe," he said. "I sold it when he died. Didn't think I'd need it." He looked at the bin, at the grain inside it, at the work that had been done. He had the look of a man who has spent several days in a crisis and is beginning, now that the crisis is over, to see it clearly. "I think I might buy another one." Paulson, who had been quiet for most of the past hour in the way of someone who is learning rather than teaching, set down his coffee cup. "I called John Deere's VP of Product this morning," he said. "I told them they need a field-serviceable emergency override, a hardware procedure that an operator can execute in under 15 minutes without cellular connectivity, without calling the support line. I told them if they don't build it, I'm going to stop recommending their machines to farmers in this county." "How'd that go?" Harold asked. "He said he'd bring it to engineering." A pause. He sounded like he might actually mean it. "That's something," Harold said. "It's not enough. But it's a start." Paulson looked at Ed, then at Harold. "I also talked to the co-op board today. We're changing the program structure. Any participating farm has to have access to at least one backup harvester that isn't on the same telematics platform as the primary equipment, older machine, different manufacturer, custom harvesting agreement. The point is redundancy. You can't design a system with one point of failure and call it reliable. Harold was quiet for a moment. My father used to say, a plan is not the same as a preparation. A plan is what you make before things go wrong. A preparation is what you make because you know things will go wrong. He looked at the bin, at the field, at the last light. The difference is whether you've admitted, to yourself, that the plan might fail. That's the difference between your shed and every other farm I work with, Paulson said. Those shelves aren't planning. They're preparation. You've already accepted that something will fail, and you've arranged your operation so that when it does, you can keep going. Harold said nothing, but he nodded slowly. They finished their coffee in the quiet of Ed Langer's farmyard, and then Harold loaded his auger into the truck and shook hands with Ed and drove home under a sky full of stars, the first truly clear night since the front had come through, the air cold and sharp and clean, the smell of cut wheat still faintly in the air. The final accounting of the 2022 harvest came in over the weeks following the rain. In terms of the county overall, the result was mixed in the way that agricultural results are always mixed. Some farms had done well, some had done less well, and the distribution of outcomes had been shaped by a combination of soil quality, crop management decisions made months earlier, and the entirely unpredictable event of a software failure that had stopped most of the county's modern combined fleet for a period ranging from 12 to 22 hours. The growers who had been last in the patch deployment queue, or who had required manual intervention from the dealer's service team, had paid the largest price. Quality discounts, custom harvesting surcharges. In a few cases, yield losses to weather. Across the county the total cost was estimated at somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000, a real number with real consequences for real families, though not, in the larger scheme of a harvest year with $8.45 wheat, catastrophic. It could have been significantly worse. The people who had made the difference were those running equipment outside the reach of the problematic update, Margaret Sorensen with her older Gleaner, a handful of other older machines in various corners of the county, and Harold Voss with his 1976 L2. Harold received several thank yous in the weeks that followed. Casseroles left on the back porch. A quart of split oak from Carl Henrichs, delivered without announcement on a Saturday morning. A half rack of good beer left anonymously at the front door. A card from Gordon Ferris that said simply, Marcus will be there December 10th. Thank you. A longer letter from Ed Langer, handwritten on lined paper, that Harold read once and put in the drawer of the farmhouse desk where he kept things worth keeping. He received, in early November, a visit from Derek Paulson. Paulson came on a Tuesday morning, knocked on the back door, the door you use when you know someone, and Harold let him in and made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table. John Deere confirmed it, Paulson said. They're adding a field-serviceable emergency reset to the operator's manual, a hardware sequence, no cellular required, executable in the field without dealer assistance. It'll be in the next manual revision. Harold nodded. That's useful. I also finished the co-op restructuring. The redundancy requirement is in the program agreement now. Any participating farm needs documented access to a backup harvester on a different platform. It's not optional. Paulson wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. I told the board what happened. All of it. The night you worked Carl's place. The 40 minutes at Ferris's farm. The way you predicted Ed Langer's moisture content from knowing his soil type. He paused. I told them that the thing that saved this county's harvest wasn't a technology system. It was a person with an old machine, 40 years of knowledge, and a parts shelf that other people called over-inventoried. Harold was quiet for a moment. How'd they take it? Mixed. Some of them got it immediately. Some wanted to quantify it. Paulson smiled slightly. I told them I'd work on quantifying it later. That we should make the structural change now and debate the metrics afterward. Harold refilled both their cups. He looked out the kitchen window at the machine shed, visible in the November gray. My father used to say something else, Harold said. About the machines he chose to run, and the ones he chose not to. He said, the question is never whether it works. The question is whether it works when everything else has stopped. He paused. He wasn't talking about equipment. He was talking about people, too, about what you're made of when the conditions aren't in your favor. Paulson was quiet, looking at his cup. You did all right, Harold said. Paulson looked up. He seemed surprised by this. When the machine stopped, Harold said, you could have managed it differently. Protected the company. Protected the program. You came out to the farms instead. You stayed in the field. Harold paused. That counts. Paulson nodded slowly, accepting this. At the door, he turned back. John Deere's regional office wants to do a case study on the incident. They asked if any growers in the county would speak with their engineering team. I'll talk to them, Harold said. I was hoping you'd say that. Paulson drove out of the yard, and Harold stood on the back step looking at the machine shed in the November light. Through the open doors he could see the Gleaner parked inside, patient in the gray autumn air. Marcus Ferris arrived on the 10th of December as promised, driving his father's truck with the careful attention of someone who has not been driving very long. He was 17 years old, lean and quiet, with his father's direct eyes and a watchful manner that Harold had noticed was increasingly uncommon in young people. He did not fill silences unnecessarily. He looked at things before he touched them. Harold had set aside the full afternoon. He had pulled the Gleaner partially out of the shed so the whole machine was accessible and the light was good. He had laid out tools on the workbench in the order he would need them. It was the preparation of a man who takes teaching seriously. I want to show you what this machine does, Harold said, when Marcus had come around to where Harold stood beside the Gleaner. Not the outside. The inside. Why it does what it does. Marcus looked at the machine, faded orange paint, cracked window, the fan visible inside the cab. He looked at it with the expression of someone who is genuinely prepared to be interested. Have you driven a combine? Harold asked. Dad's. The new one. Since I was 12. Do you know what it's doing when it's running? Marcus thought about it. I know the basic sequence. Header cuts it, feeder brings it in, cylinder threshes it, sieves separate the grain from the chaff. Good. Now I'm going to show you why it works that way. Harold put his hand on the feeder house. Why does the cylinder turn at the speed it does? What happens to the grain if the clearance is wrong? And how do you know, without a display screen telling you, that something is starting to go wrong? Marcus looked more interested. How do you know? You listen, Harold said. Come here. They spent the first hour on the threshing system, Harold explaining the physics of impact and friction, the relationship between cylinder speed and concave clearance, what too much of one and too little of the other did to grain quality and recovery. He showed Marcus the cylinder bars, the concave panels, the adjusters. He explained how different crop conditions, dry wheat versus tough wheat, high yield versus thin crop, required different settings and how you read the grain coming out of the elevator to know if the settings were right. Modern machines do this automatically, Marcus said. Based on sensors. They do, Harold said. The sensor measures the result and adjusts the cause. But if you understand the cause, you can read the result yourself, you don't need the sensor to tell you. And when the sensor fails, you know what to do, Marcus said. You know what to do. And you know why you're doing it, which means you can adapt when the situation is something the sensor wasn't designed for. They moved through the machine systematically, the cleaning shoe and its airflow, the grain elevator and its chain, the feeder house drive, the header drive and its slip clutch, the engine and its service intervals. Harold showed Marcus the parts shelf and explained the logic of what was stocked there, not everything, but the things that failed most commonly and at the worst times, the things that were hard to get quickly, the things that were cheap to stock and catastrophic to be without. This is your insurance policy, Harold said, running his hand along a row of sealed parts boxes. Every item on this shelf is something that failed on this machine or a machine like it at a time when being without it was very expensive. This shelf is memory. It's 40 years of failures, turned into preparedness. Marcus looked at the shelf for a long moment. My dad said the same thing about your machine being there during harvest. That it was insurance. He's right. Though I didn't think of it that way at the time. I just thought of it as the machine I understood and could keep running. At 3:30 they took a break. Harold made coffee and they sat on overturned 5-gallon buckets in the shed doorway, drinking coffee and looking at the December fields lying flat and brown in the afternoon light. My dad told me what happened this harvest, Marcus said. He said if you hadn't been here, you and your old machine, we'd have lost a significant piece of the crop. He was shaken by how close it was. Harold drank his coffee and said nothing. He also said you turned down the custom harvesting payment. That you asked for this instead, for him to send me over. That's right. Why? Harold looked at the field. A red-tailed hawk was working the fence line, drifting on the cold air, looking for movement in the stubble below. Because money is replaceable, Harold said. What I wanted to teach you is not. He paused, finding the right words. Your father farms with modern equipment. You'll farm with equipment that's more modern still, machines built in 15 or 20 years that none of us can currently imagine. They'll be better than mine in every measurable way, But the thing that makes a farmer is not the machine. It's the relationship with the machine. The understanding of what it's doing and why, deep enough that you can work with it instead of just through it. He paused again. When I'm gone, this machine will probably go with me. But if I can put the habit of understanding into one more person, that carries forward. That's worth more than a check. Marcus was quiet for a while, looking at the hawk still working the fence line. My grandfather had a lathe, he said finally. Dad sold it when he died. Said he didn't know how to use it. Your dad told me the same story about Ed Langer's father, Harold said. Ed's buying a new lathe this winter. Learning to use it. Is that, Marcus hesitated. Is that what you're saying I should do? Learn the old ways? I'm saying you should know what's underneath the new ways, Harold said. The computer on your father's combine is managing the cylinder clearance. But the cylinder clearance exists because of physics that hasn't changed since 1835 when the first combine was built. If you know the physics, you can evaluate what the computer is telling you. You can catch it when it's wrong. You can override it when you need to. He looked at Marcus. That's not old thinking. That's deep thinking. And deep thinking never goes out of style. They finished their coffee and went back to the machine. They worked until the shed light came on automatically at 4:15, and then Harold walked Marcus through a complete lubrication sequence, every grease fitting on the machine, in order, with the reasoning for each. It was the last thing in the day's curriculum and in some ways the most important, because it was the ritual that sustained everything else. The small faithful attention, repeated season after season, that kept the machine ready. When Marcus said he should get home for dinner, Harold walked him to his truck. Marcus had grease on his hands and a small cut on his left thumb where a sharp edge on the cylinder cover had caught him, and he had the look of someone who has spent the afternoon acquiring something they intend to keep. Next time you're in a combine, Harold said, listen to what it's doing. Not just whether the screen says everything is fine. Listen to the machine itself. There's a sound it makes when everything is running as it should, and a different sound when something is starting to go wrong. Learn the difference. I will, Marcus said. Good. Harold shook his hand. Drive safe. He watched the truck go down the farm lane and out onto the county road, the tail lights dwindling in the December dark. Then he turned back to the shed and pulled the doors shut against the cold. Inside, the Gleaner waited in the dark. The letter from John Deere arrived in January, on a Tuesday, in a plain envelope with a Moline, Illinois postmark. It was from a man named Thomas Park, who identified himself as a senior engineer in the company's machine control systems division. He wrote with the directness that engineers have when they are communicating about something that genuinely interests them, not the language of public relations but the language of someone working on a problem. Park explained that he and two colleagues had been assigned to conduct a post-incident analysis going beyond the technical failure itself, to examine the broader question of operator autonomy and machine dependency in modern agricultural equipment. Harold's situation, an older machine continuing to operate independently throughout the incident, provided what Park called a structurally useful contrast case. He asked if Harold would speak with the engineering team by video call. He also wrote a paragraph that Harold read 3 times before setting the letter down. There is an ongoing debate within our engineering team about the appropriate balance between connectivity-dependent features and standalone operational capability. One side argues that continuous data collection and remote management capabilities provide such substantial benefits that the dependency they require is a reasonable trade-off. The other side argues that a machine that cannot perform its core functions independently of external systems, in any foreseeable failure mode, is not fully serving its user. Your situation in October represents real-world evidence for this debate that we have not previously had in such clear form, and I believe your perspective would be valuable to us. Harold read this and thought about Edwin's story about the Alice Chalmers. He thought about the engineers in Moline having the same argument that Edwin had been having with himself in 1973, the same fundamental argument about where control should sit, about what it meant to trust a machine, about the relationship between what a tool could do in ideal conditions and what it would do when conditions were not ideal. He thought about David, who built software systems for a living and who had, on the phone in September, confirmed Harold's instinct about exactly this kind of vulnerability. He made a note to call David and tell him about Park's letter. He wrote back by hand, on line paper. He said he would speak with the engineering team, and gave 2 available dates. He also wrote, "You asked about the balance between connectivity and standalone capability. I want to give you an honest answer, which is that I don't think I'm qualified to tell you where that balance should be. That's an engineering and business question and you understand it far better than I do. What I can tell you is what the question looks like from a wheat field in Nebraska. I can operate my machine. When it breaks I can fix it. No one outside this county has any say in whether it runs or not. That is a specific kind of freedom that I have been willing to pay a real cost for, in efficiency, in features, in the extra time I spend on maintenance that a modern machine would handle automatically. Whether that trade is the right one for everyone is not for me to say. But I think there are more farmers who would make that trade than the industry currently assumes, if the trade were honestly presented. The thing I hope your debate produces is this, that a farmer who buys the most modern machine you make should still, in any foreseeable failure mode, be able to use that machine to harvest his crop. Whatever connectivity and software it carries should be additions to that capability, not prerequisites for it. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to want. I hope the answer isn't that it's impossible. He mailed the letter and went back to the machine shed. The video call with the John Deere engineers happened on a Tuesday afternoon in February. Harold set up David's old laptop. David had sent it after Harold mentioned the call, saying the farm's desktop was too old for reliable video, on the kitchen table and talked to Thomas Park and two colleagues for nearly 2 hours. He told them about October 5th. About the call from Carl Hendricks at 8:15 in the morning, and what he had thought about in the cab of the Gleaner before he lowered the header and kept moving. About the night on Carl's fields by headlights, and the morning at Ferris's farm, and the 40 minutes before the rain. About what Gordon Ferris had said standing in the rain, the difference between liability and asset is sometimes just a software update. He told them about Edwin's principle, the thing Edwin had said sitting in the cab of the Minneapolis Moline, waiting for the grain tank to fill. Give me a machine I don't understand and it breaks, I'm helpless. He told them about the parts shelf and what it represented. He told them about Marcus Ferris, 17 years old, spending an afternoon in December learning the physics of threshing. The engineers listened with the quality of attention that Harold recognized, the focused listening of people hearing something that confirms what they already suspected but hadn't been able to demonstrate clearly. At the end, Thomas Park said, "We're presenting a design framework we're calling operational sovereignty, the principle that any machine we build should be capable of performing its core functions without external connectivity in any failure mode, and that the connectivity-dependent features should enhance that capability without becoming prerequisites for it." Your situation in October is the lead example in the presentation. Operational sovereignty, Harold said. That's a good name for it. I thought so. Will it change anything? Park was quiet for a moment. It will change some things. Probably not as quickly as I'd like, but the conversation is different now than it was 6 months ago, and I think that matters. Harold nodded. It was an honest answer. He appreciated it. After the call, he sat for a while at the kitchen table looking out at the machine shed in the winter light. He thought about David, who had listened to the full account when Harold called him about the call, who had been quiet for a long moment and then said, "Dad, that principle you described, machines that can operate independently of external systems as their baseline, with connected features as additions, that's actually a really important design philosophy. The fact that they're taking it seriously is significant." Harold had thought about that. About his son, who understood code, telling him that something a farmer had said in a wheat field was a significant contribution to a design philosophy. The world worked in circles sometimes. Epilogue, the field in spring. In March, when the ground was still frozen but the light was beginning to have the depth it gets in late winter when the sun climbs higher, Harold drove out to the east field in the early morning. He walked the field the way his father had walked it and his grandfather before that, slowly, reading the soil, looking at the cover crop he had planted in October. He stopped at the corner where the old stream bed had left its sandy signature in the soil, where the frost came out of the ground faster than the rest of the field, where the cover crop was already showing a faint green suggestion of life. Old August had noticed the same thing about this corner 100 years ago. He had noted it in a journal that was lost sometime in the 1940s, but whose observations had passed, as practical knowledge passes, through Edwin to Harold in the form of remembered advice. Watch that northwest corner. The sand takes care of itself, but it needs a different hand than the clay ground. Harold stood in the corner for a moment and looked at the whole field, at the flat Nebraska horizon in every direction, at the big pale sky, at the cover crop lying brown and gray against the frozen soil and the faint, stubborn green beginning at its margins. He thought about David's last visit, in November as promised, 3 days on the farm, walking the fields, asking questions about drainage and soil and yield history that were the questions of someone building a map of a place in his mind. David had driven back to Omaha on a Sunday afternoon and had called that evening, from the road, and said, "I've been thinking about what you and I talked about in September. About systems that can't fail. About what it means to understand the thing you're depending on. I think I've been building systems for other people that have the same problem your neighbors combined had. I've been thinking about that. Harold had not said what he thought, which was that this was the beginning of something. He had said, the door's always open, and David had said, I know. That's why I haven't been worried about taking my time. On the wall beside the back door of the farmhouse there was a photograph in a plain wooden frame, 3 men in a wheat field at harvest, in black and white, squinting against a bright summer sun. The oldest was old August in approximately 1949, square-built, suspenders, flat cap. Beside him was Edwin as a young man of 20, already carrying the upright posture Harold associated with his father's adult face. On August's other side was a boy of perhaps 8 or 9, Edwin's older brother Carl, who had died in Korea in 1951. 3 generations in a wheat field. 2 of them gone. The wheat field still there. Harold thought about continuity and discontinuity, how each generation learned what they could from the one before, filled the gaps with their own experience, made their own mistakes, and tried to leave the place better than they found it. Not always succeeding. Sometimes failing. But trying, generation by generation, to keep the thread unbroken. He turned and walked back toward the farmstead, his boots dark with the thawing soil. There was a word for what he was trying to pass on, what Edwin had passed to him and August had passed to Edwin, without ever using the word itself. A German word that August had apparently brought from Wisconsin and applied to farming in general and to the operation of equipment in particular. Edwin had mentioned it once, almost in passing, years after August was gone. The word was Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feeling. The sensitivity that comes from intimate familiarity. The ability to know a thing by touch and sound and the quality of its resistance. The knowledge that lives in hands and not in manuals. Old August had said, according to Edwin, that farming without Fingerspitzengefühl was not farming but management, and that management was what you did when you didn't understand the thing you were managing. Harold had spent 40 years thinking about that distinction, and he found it more accurate, not less, as he aged. You could manage a farm from a distance, from a data platform, from a telematics dashboard, from a series of recommendations generated by an algorithm that had processed 10,000 farms similar to yours. Farmers did this now and some of them did it well. But the thing Harold had, the thing he was trying to give to Marcus Ferris, and that he hoped David was finding his way toward, was something different. It was the knowledge of this specific land, these specific machines, this specific season, in this specific county, accumulated through 40 years of close and faithful attention. It could not be uploaded or transmitted or purchased. It could only be earned. He went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and drank his coffee. Outside the window, the east field lay in the March light, brown and patient, waiting for the season to turn. The machine shed was visible beyond the fence line, its big doors still closed against the last cold. The Gleaner was inside it. In April, Harold would pull open those doors and roll the machine out into the spring light and begin the pre-harvest service. He would check the belts and the bearings and the cylinder clearances and the sickle sections in the elevator chain, working through the checklist he had memorized so thoroughly that he no longer needed the paper version, though he kept it in the cab anyway. He would check everything, and he would understand everything he checked, and the machine would be ready when the season called for it. And somewhere across the county, Marcus Ferris would climb into his father's combine and listen, really listen, to what the machine was doing underneath the interface, underneath the sensor readings, underneath the automated adjustments. The physical reality of grain separating from plant, of the irreducible mechanical logic that no software update could touch. And in Omaha, David Voss would sit at his desk building software systems and think, as he had told his father he was thinking, about what it meant to design something that could fail gracefully, that gave control back to the person depending on it rather than keeping it in a server room in another state. Small things. The accumulation of small things. Harold finished his coffee, put on his jacket, and went out to the machine shed. The Gleaner was waiting, patient in the cold dark, holding its place in the ongoing story of this land and these people in the long, faithful work of keeping things going. The doors opened. The morning light came in. It was time to begin. The 2022 John Deere software incident described in this story is fictional, though the vulnerability it depicts, the dependency of modern agricultural machinery on external software systems for basic operation, is a documented and ongoing concern in the agricultural community. Farmers, right-to-repair advocates, and agricultural policy researchers have raised real and serious questions about software lock-in and operational autonomy in modern farm equipment. The farming practices, equipment types, and agricultural knowledge in this story are based on real methods and real machines. The 1976 Gleaner L2, The Physics of Torque versus Horsepower, the 13. 5% moisture threshold at the elevator, the practice of reading crop conditions by eye and feel. These details are grounded in genuine agricultural practice. The concept of Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feeling, is real, derived from German and used in various professional contexts to describe the deep, tactile, experiential knowledge that comes only from long practice. All characters are fictional. Dodge County, Nebraska is real. The land there remembers everything.